What up, y'all? It's Dev, SBMTG. We like it of Magic, and today it's a family affair. A phrase that's always bothered me a little bit, but I guess today it makes sense because we're going to look at 5 sexy decks. Decks, by the way, is what I said there. YouTube algorithm that searches for dirty words in your videos to determine whether your video is monetizable or not. Decks. Get your mind out of the gutter, YouTube. Anyway, there are 5 families on New Capenna, and you know, I was going to originally do this in 5 different videos. It was going to take a couple of weeks to cover every family, and I thought, no, that's silly. By the time you get it all out, everyone will have moved on from the content. Who wants that? So just do it all on the very day the set drops on Arena. So that's where we are now. New Capenna's out on Arena. Go play it after you watch this video. Watch this video first. But first, how was your pre-release? Just asking. Good times. But secondly, might as well tell you before we really get into it here to like the video, do all the YouTube stuff, subscribe to the channel for more content. If you like what I'm doing around here and you want to see more of it, subscribe and then you get me your notifications feed and your recommended and stuff. It's gonna be nice. You're gonna like it. Also, might as well tell you that if you like anything you see in this video, you want to check out some of these decks for yourself, just hit the description below me. It's under this area somewhere. A lot going on below this area, but the description box is down there too. That contains the deck list. That's handy if you want to see the mana bases and all that. And I get a little kickback. I'm not going to lie. If you order any of the cards from the deck list in the description, I get a little hit of the sauce. So if you want to help me out, that's a good way of doing it. While also getting to play these sweet decks. So without further adu, that was a lot of pitch work, and I apologize for that. But since you made it through that, we both did together. I hate doing it. I was the one that had to do it. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk about our first deck, the Cabaretti. Now, the Callous Cabaretti have a token theme in this set, and they use the Alliance mechanic. So we're going to try and get as much juice out of that as we possibly can. Now, we are going to play, unlike some of the other decks on this list, we are going to play a few of the legends available to this family. Let's start with Jenny and the Jets. That's Jetmir and Jenny Faye. Now, I'm from the South, and I've known a few people named Jenny Faye, and you have to say it like that. Jenny Faye, Jetmir second. And even though her name is Jetmir second, I think she's actually the more impressive of these 2 legends. But I'll talk about Jetmir first. Now with Jetmir, we have 11 cards in our deck capable of producing multiple token creatures over the course of a game, not to mention all the actual creatures that we're playing. So it's not actually hard to get at least the first couple of modes some of the time on Jetmir and have a really big team that's also very wide. And hey, I get it. I'm a guy that's both tall and wide, so I can sympathize. But like I said, Jenny Faye is the better of these 2 cards in a lot of situations. It would appear, at least. Not only do we have those 11 things that are capable of generating multiple tokens in a game, but we also have 8 creatures that are capable of generating treasure tokens. So at the end of the day, that's a ton of dogs or cats, whatever you want to make, with Jenny. And let's talk about how we're going to do that. We've got 4 copies of Wedding Announcement, 3 copies of Asika's Chariot, and 2 copies of the Wandering Emperor, just to get things started off. All of these cards are just extremely powerful cards in Standard, so you got that going for you. But there's extra synergies with them in this deck, making them even more powerful, if that was possible. Sometimes the card draw in Wedding Announcement is actually the best part of the card because there's not a whole lot of ways to get card advantage in this deck, and it's one of the weaknesses, but Wedding Announcement lets us do that, and eventually it gives us an Anthem effect that'll play really well with all the creature generation in the deck. Asika's Chariot is obviously a great play the turn after a Jenny Faye because you can upgrade the cats to haste, or you can just put 6 total power with vigilance on the battlefield if that's what you'd rather do. An Emperor, of course, is just, I don't know, one of the top 3 cards in Standard, writ large at this point, so it's probably going to be not only in a deck with white, but a deck that's trying to make tokens. This does that, is also a removal piece, and makes our tokens and other dudes bigger over the course of a game, so we'll take it. But of course, the most important thing about these, again, is that they work so well with Jetmir and Jenny Faye. All of these create multiple tokens over the course of a game. That's good with Jenny, obviously, but with Jetmir, these put enough tokens out to ensure that you can get at least one of the modes on Jetmir quickly. Now we've got more cards that make tokens, but not necessarily creature tokens. We've got 4 copies of Prosperous Innkeeper and 4 copies of Gala Greeters. These are both somewhat similar cards, but Prospero tends to be better on turn 2, where you can ramp into an Asika's Chariot or a Wandering Emperor, some other 4-drop, right? But Gala Greeters tends to be better over the long game, which you tend to get in a lot of with this deck. Gala Greeters, just like a wedding announcement or a Wandering Emperor, can make our creatures incrementally bigger over the course of a game, and that's usually better than you think it is. The +1/+1 counter ability tends to be undervalued on this, but you'll be doing it a lot more than you think to get advantage on the board over an opponent, so you can actually make a profitable attack. But aside from that, obviously the second ability that makes a tap treasure token goes really well with Jenny Faye, which in turn goes really well with Jetmir. That's something I want to point out, is that with both Prosperous Innkeeper and Gala Greeters, if you've got a Jenny Faye out, you can turn these treasure tokens into creatures, which helps you fulfill the condition on Jetmir of having as many creatures as it takes to get these different Anthem effects. But we are going to play around the Alliance mechanic a little bit in our tokens deck, so let's play 4 copies of Devilish Valet and 4 copies of Witty Roastmaster. Now, these probably aren't the absolute best cards in the entire world, but there were 2 cards that I could not wait to play with. Devilish Valet can do so many fun things in this deck. You play an Asika's Chariot on the next turn and you get in for a beefy amount of damage. It works well if you have a Wandering Emperor out and you can play, say, a creature or an effect that makes multiple creatures and also get a token off of Wandering Emperor, and suddenly, again, you're swinging in for a lot of damage. If you have a Jenny Faye out, and a Gala Greeters, for instance, and you start playing creatures, well, then suddenly you can kind of double up on the creatures that you're playing, because your treasure tokens from Gala Greeters will turn into creatures from Jenny Faye, and then suddenly Devilish Valet is getting really big. Same thing with Roastmaster, right? Anything that makes treasure tokens, like an Innkeeper or a Gala Greeters, for instance, can suddenly start pinging for damage by making these 2/2 haste cats and stuff, so you can get in for damage, that combat step with the cats, but you're also dealing a little bit of incremental damage with the Roastmaster, and sometimes that's a little bit of extra reach to help finish games off. So I know these aren't maybe the best possible ways to use these slots, but they maybe are the funnest possible ways to use these slots, and in the end of the day, that's kind of what I care about most. There's also 2 copies of Cabaret Charm and 3 copies of Fateful Absence to finish off the main deck here. Fateful Absence is just kind of a catch-all removal spell that I'd like to play some number of in this deck. And then Cabaret Charm, giving all of our dudes trample, is kind of the best part of the card in later game scenarios. But if you have to spend this as removal, it's usually a pretty good piece. You know, there's a reason that I chose to start the video with Cabaret. This is probably the most fun, just pure fun, of all the decks that we'll talk about today. I mean, again, we get to play Roastmaster, we get to play Devilish Valet, we get to do fun stuff with Jenny Faye, and that's super fun. Like, that's the kind of deck that I can co-sign on and really get into. We're going to look at some kind of serious decks, especially as we go a little bit deeper into the video, but just to kind of start it with a goofball deck that can win you some games and have a lot of fun along the way, this is probably my favorite deck in the video for strictly those purposes, but don't let that make you think it's just jank. But let's move on next to the Malignant Maestros, and you might think that I would be tempted, especially knowing me, to do like a sacrifice deck of some kind, work around the casualty theme, whatever. No. If you really know me, just an extra layer on the dev iceberg, then you know that I cannot resist the temptation to make a Reanimator deck. So that's what we're going to be looking at right now. Full disclosure, this is actually an Olivia Crimson Bride deck. Yeah, a little Grixis Olivia action again. It's been a while, but we're back. This is one of my favorite decks a couple of seasons ago. And this time, we can do it even better because we got Lord Xander the Collector from this set, which, by the way, happens to be a legendary vampire, so it works really well with an Olivia. And in this list, there's plenty of ways to just ramp Lord Xander into play the old-fashioned way. So even if you don't have the milkshakes to bring your boys to the yard and reanimate Xander, you just play him like a normal Magic card. But in a real Reanimator deck, we can't just have a couple of Reanimator targets, so let's also work in a couple of copies of Jin Gitaxias. The Progress Tyrant, this is probably the other best reanimation target in the format. It's really close between this and Hullbreaker Horror, but in a deck that doesn't have all of the instant speed interaction that I really want it to have, I think it's probably best that we go ahead and play Jin Gitaxias. But that can't be all a Reanimator deck does, is have big dudes. It's also got to reanimate those guys. So let's play 4 copies of Graveyard Shift, along with our 3 copies of Olivia, who is effectively a reanimation spell in and of herself. Now, there's a lot of spells you can play in this slot. I'm prioritizing Graveyard Shift because it's a brand new card I want to play with, but the fact that this can be played at instant speed is kind of a big deal, you know? That frees up our mana on our turn so that where we can be more reactive, play the removal spells, play the counter spells, if that's what we want to do, but we can also just play, for say, a Graveyard Shift at the end of their turn if they don't give us anything to react to. But we do need those milkshakes if our boys are going to be in the yard. And our milkshakes are really good in this deck because they allow us to do all kinds of other stuff, right? We get to play Big Score and Prismari Command and Maestro's Charm in this deck. These are very delicious milkshakes in this case, right? Like, Big Score is basically just a better unexpected windfall. We can play Big Score at the end of our opponent's turn and then go play a land and suddenly have the mana to just play Lord Xander without reanimating it. That's pretty good. But even if we just Big Score at the end of our opponent's turn, usually we don't have to even play a land. We just have the mana to play Olivia and then get into Lord Xander. So it's not too hard to ramp into Olivia a turn ahead of schedule, or Lord Xander a full 2 turns ahead of schedule in a lot of cases. Big Score is just an incredible card, but so is Prismari Command. This also has a mode on it that allows us to dump creatures in the graveyard for later, draw more cards just like Big Score to help us get to the cards we need to get to for whatever stage of the Reanimator game plan we're in, right? So we need to churn. Both these cards do that. We need to ramp. Both these cards do that. So we need to discard cards. Both these cards do that. They're just not really 2 more perfect cards in the format than these for a deck like this. But I'm also playing the Maestro's Charm in here, right? This can put 4 cards into our graveyard, which is important, but it's also a removal spell. The middle mode is fine if your opponent's at exactly 3 life or less, but for the most part, the first 2 modes are where we want to be on this card, and it's just a plus that the first mode effectively puts a bunch of cards in our yard for us. But I'm also playing 4 Ledger Shredder and 4 Tainted Indulgence in the deck. Now, Ledger Shredder does not grow on every turn, but do note that it grows when your opponent plays 2 spells. And your opponent very often will play 2 spells, but there's ways to do it in our deck. We do have a couple of cheap spells that we're playing and a number of 2 mana spells, so it's not impossible to double spell on multiple turns, especially when you get big scores going into Prismari Commands and you're getting all the treasure production. You can play multiple spells, grow your Ledger Shredder, dump a big dude in the yard, draw a card, get, all the stuff you want to do with the Ledger Shredder. And then other times, it just blocks, which is also fine sometimes too. But also, obviously, Tainted Indulgence is just an unbelievable Magic card. On turn 2, at instant speed, we can dump a huge dude in the graveyard and draw 2 cards. But later on in the game, this is just a way to just draw 2 at instant speed for 2 mana, which is a pretty busted rate in Standard. So let's play all of these we can get our hands on. But we also have to play some just normal non-game plan Magic cards to make sure we don't die. So let's play 2 copies of Bloodchief's Thirst and 2 copies of Infernal Grasp. I was playing Corpse Explosion. Before you ask, I was playing 2 copies of Corpse Explosion. It basically always exiles the creature that you want to reanimate from your graveyard. So maybe do it in the sideboard. Maybe that's where you want Explosion. But I just could not make the card work the way I wanted it to. But Bloodchief's Thirst is a great, very cheap removal spell right now that combines pretty well with Ledger Shredder when you want to cast 2 spells in a turn because it's so inexpensive to cast, but it's also good at wiping out Planeswalkers, which you want to do in this format right now. And Infernal Grasp, even though it does cost us in terms of our life total, which can suck sometimes, it's also just 2 mana, instant speed, pointed at a thing that won't kill you now. So I think that's usually worth the 2 life in most situations. Now, if you do it right with this deck, you can pretty easily get a turn 4 Olivia on the table that also brings a Xander into play that same turn. And then they end up swinging for 10, and you mind twist your opponent really early in the game, and you just feel great. You just feel so good about that happening, and it kind of happens a lot. And finally for this deck, this is probably the best context in which to play a Lord Xander if you want to play it in competitive Standard Magic. I mean, if you want to play it in Commander or something, that's fine. You want to play it on the kitchen table, that's fine. But if you actually want to really get the most possible juice out of a Lord Xander, I think that a Reanimator build that's very similar to this one is probably the best way to do it. But let's move on to the Raucous Riveteers. This is one of my favorite decks of the day too, because it is smash mouth football, work you out Jack. Like, this deck is just pulling no punches. Put it right in the kisser. How many more of these do I have, right? This deck will just drop an anvil on you, steamroll right through you, no apologies, no fancy stuff, no frills. I don't have no combos, nothing like that. I just want to stomp your face until you don't have a face no more, and I can respect that. And that all starts with Agnes, 3 copies of the Dragon's Lash, but we're also playing 4 Crew Captain and 2 Zayator's Envoy to start things off. I was a little skittish about Envoy to start things, but really, 2 copies of this card I think is just about right. The best thing about this is blitzing it into play, and not just because Agnes is in the deck. Blitzing this into play gets you a quick, out of nowhere 5 power threat that occasionally just gets you a couple of cards, which is pretty disgusting. You draw the card off of it, dying at the end of the turn, and you get a pretty deep card off of it as well, just getting 3 for combat damage. The trample helps it get 3 for combat damage. Envoy was too good of a card not to play a couple of copies of, and it effectively really knocked a couple of other 5-drops out of contention that I wanted to play more, but I just had to try Envoy, and it didn't disappoint. Crew Captain didn't either. I have said before, this is one of my favorite cards from the entire set, and I expect good things from it. And it did good things in the playtesting I was able to do, proxying decks up for this video, but this is my element. This is how we used to do it before Arena back in the day. Everybody, proxying up decks is where I live, so this was fun the last week or so making this video. But Crew Captain has been very impressive when you can get the mana for it, but as expected, that's sometimes the problem on turn 3. Good thing is, this card is still kind of fine on turn 4. I actually really want to try the old Agnes Jenny Faye combo out, and just, instead of making treasure tokens, you make a bunch of cats or whatever. That, I want to do it, but just in this deck. We'll stick to this deck for now. Agnes has been pretty impressive, and there's plenty of times you'll swing just to get the treasure token. But anyway, we'll move on, because we're also playing 2 copies of Helena and Elena, which can give our dudes haste. 4 copies of Reckless Stormseeker, which can give our dudes haste. And 4 copies of Tenacious Underdog. Underdog can have haste out of our graveyard, so that's kind of nice, but it's also good to have Stormseeker occasionally or Helena and Elena to give it haste when we play it off the top of our library. Aside from that, though, this is a great card for going late into the game after sweepers and stuff like that. Tenacious Underdog can really help us grind and draw cards in the meantime, which is pretty sweet. Between this and Zayator's Envoy and stuff, we've got plenty of ways to draw cards in the deck, which is pretty cool. It's also nice to have something to give the Asika's Chariot in our deck haste. Right? We need that. So let's play 3 copies of Asika's Chariot, but we've also got 4 copies of Ranger Class and 4 copies of Kumano Faces Kakazan. I really would like to get on board as early as possible, and I'm very greedy, and I want the curve of, 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop Agnes. They all have haste. Let's make treasures. I'm greedy. I want that. So Kumano's a good way to do that. We have enough 2-drops in the deck to where we basically always get a +1/+1 counter on a thing on turn 2. We get a haste guy on 3. So, and obviously the exile clause on the 2/2 here is more important than it seems in a lot of games. So Kumano is just a good card. It is one of the better cards with haste in the whole format. I'm playing all 4 copies, but Ranger Class is a great way to use all the treasure that we get off of Agnes over the course of a game, right? We can just level up Ranger Class, and often a great way to use the mana. This is another way to draw cards in this deck, which again, we don't have all the ways of doing, but it's very welcome. This also helps us win long games by growing our creatures and stuff, puts a token into play when it comes into play, so just a sweet little card here that I really like a lot in this deck. Speaking of good creatures, there's also 4 copies of Goldspan Dragon in the deck. I also just wanted to play Goldspan because it's actually the best haste creature in Standard, so let's play that. But there's also 2 copies of Infernal Grasp in this deck because it's a removal spell. That's the only... If you draw one, make sure you use it wisely, because you only have 2. For the most part, though, you really hope you don't need too many removal spells in this deck. Again, you just want to hopefully go first and then proceed to completely steamroll your opponent's ambitions, not only in Magic the Gathering, but in life. Crush your enemies and see them driven before you. That's what this deck does best. Really, we just want to embarrass fools with much, much bigger creatures than they're playing on much, much earlier turns than they're playing them, and that's what this deck does best. Again, kind of a Neanderthal caveman strategy, but again, I do respect it in this regard. Against an opponent that's not ready for it, and also you have perfect mana, a curve of Kumano Faces Kakazan into Tenacious Underdog into a Crew Captain, for instance, is just kind of hard to beat, and if they do beat that, you've probably got another haste threat on the next turn. And the next turn, and yeah, it keeps going on like that. This deck has a frightening amount of card advantage for an aggro deck between Zayator's Envoy, the blitz on that draws you a card, and Tenacious Underdog, which can continue to draw cards throughout the game. And also, Ranger class getting leveled up entirely. That's a lot of card advantage in a deck with a ton of creatures. You'll have creatures on top of your library if you level up Ranger class. Honestly, there's kind of way more card advantage than you might expect in this deck, while not really sacrificing too much in the way of speed. So check this one out if you want to jund them out. But let's move on to the auspicious Obscura here. Does that work? Yeah, that works. Obscura. You can do all kinds of stuff with this. You can make the Connive deck. You can make a Reanimator deck, and I think make it work pretty well with the Obscura, but we've already done that. So, with the Obscura, let's go full-on control mode. The reason I want to do that is because Obscura just has all the best removal and spells and stuff now. Like, we got 4 copies of Void Rend, 3 copies of Vanishing Verse, which we already have, but 2 copies of Obscura Charm as well, which we didn't have. And yeah, I think you can play all 3 of these cards in the same deck. I think you can play Void Rend alongside Charm. Void Rend is, however, just the single best removal spell in the entire format, and Vanishing Verse is the second best removal spell in the whole format, and now Esper gets to play both of them, so you should probably do that. That's advice. That's good advice, I think. But our control deck should also counter spells. It's a bit of a misconception that a control deck must counter spells, but we're playing blue, we probably should. Let's play 3 copies of Obscura Interceptor, 1 copy of Negate, and a copy of Disdainful Stroke to start this off. Now, I know that Interceptor isn't a straight-up counterspell, but it's going to feel like one a good bit of the time, and it's unbelievable tempo against most opponents. If you can counter their turn 4 or 5, 4 or 5 mana play, and get a, sometimes 4 power flying lifelinker out, yeah, that's probably going to win a lot of races. And Negate and Disdainful Stroke are just good counterspells. Disdainful Stroke will actually counter for good your opponent's 4 or 5 drops. That's nice. Negate will often do the exact same thing in a format with a ton of playable Planeswalkers. These are especially very good cards. But there's also another counterspell that we're playing in this deck. 4 whole copies of Make Disappear. Now, I'm not going to lie, there just aren't a whole lot of creatures in this deck to sacrifice to this. There are a few, so the card's not entirely dead in terms of its casualty mode, but honestly, just a miscalculate, a mana leak, sort of, a mana leak that makes them pay 1 less mana, is just kind of good enough to play a lot of the time in this format, right? I mean, you'll catch your opponent with this on turn 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 even some of the time, depending on how many spells they're trying to play, what spells they're trying to play. Sometimes all your opponent needs to do is have the mana up to, say, activate a creature land, but also they need to cast a 2 or 3 mana spell. So you'll deprive them of being able to use their creature land, or maybe they swing in with their creature land first, leave mana up for a removal spell on your turn. Then suddenly you can just Make Disappear, and the fact that they swung with a creature land will really bite them in the butt. There are a lot of ways to use this card even later on in the game. And I've already gushed about Make Disappear a number of times, and if I do it anymore, I think someone's going to make me disappear. But this is just a very good Magic card on lots of different turns. However, we do have ways of making creatures to sacrifice to a Make Disappear if we absolutely need to. We've got 4 copies of Kaito Shizuki and 3 copies of the Wandering Emperor, along with 1 copy of Hullbreaker Horror. You probably shouldn't sacrifice your Hullbreaker Horror to a Make Disappear, but you might be able to do it as like the ultimate flex play, right? Your opponent has an answer for something, so you sacrifice your Hullbreaker Horror to a Make Disappear, counter the thing they were going to do, and then you, I don't know, activate a Hall of Storm Giants and swing in for the win. It could work. If you really need to flex hard. But Hullbreaker Horror is mostly in there to be the absolute best control win condition in Standard in the last, I don't know, ever, 10 years or so. You play at least 1 copy of that card. But Wandering Emperor is also a control mage's best friend. And again, makes things you can sacrifice. But for the most part, you want to be killing creatures or making dudes that you can swing with Wandering Emperor, depending on what stage of the game plan you're in your control deck. But Kaito Shizuki can just draw cards, which is good. It can make creatures, which is good. Those creatures are unblockable, which is good. You can sacrifice those dudes to make disappear, which is good. There's just not a bad thing about Kaito in this deck. There's also 2 copies of Memory Deluge in this deck, and Honestly, I thought about playing a number of other cards that are easier to cast in this slot, but there's just nothing better than Memory Deluge, right? I think it's worth paying the other blue mana for, even if you have to wait an extra turn or two to actually get it. But a lot of the time, if you do have a problem getting that second blue mana right now, there are plenty of effects in this deck that make you discard cards. There's a few, so you can just get rid of a Memory Deluge that you're having trouble casting and cast it later in the game out of your yard, which is sometimes an important function. Now, to finish things off, a control deck needs sweepers, and we got a few good ones here. We got 4 copies of Depopulate, which could just as easily be Doomscar or whatever sweeper you choose to play, but brand new card, I want to try it out. Let's take Depopulate for a spin and play a playset, but there's also a copy of Farewell in here, which is pretty good in a deck with so many Planeswalkers, and even a copy of Faithful Absence. Even with all the Void Rends and Vanishing Verses, Counterspells, Obscura Charms, and stuff, I still found room for one more one-for-one point-and-click removal spell like Faithful Absence. Now, I know it might be tempting to play Shambling Ghasts and Eye Twitches and all that kind of stuff in this deck along with Deadly Disputes, so that you have something to sacrifice to casualty or make disappear, and you have the Deadly Dispute place you can ramp in and stuff. Yeah, it's tempting, but then I think you lose slots for your more control-y stuff, your Counterspells, your Void Rends, your Flash Planeswalkers, your Hullbreaker Horrors and stuff. Again, I'm not sure that this deck list is 100% where it needs to be. Maybe you want to split between some number of Make Disappear and some number of Draw or Disruption, right? There are probably more optimal ways of doing it, but I think if you want just a very, very strong control deck on day one that you can tune for yourself, this is a pretty good one right here. But let's move on to the big boy brokers. This is not, in a lot of ways, to me at least, the most interesting of the guilds. And at first, I wanted to do a whole shield counters deck, but that just didn't do well, turned out. So I tried to do something else here, and it's not the most original thing in the world, but I do think that it's something Brokers does well because it's the only deck that gets to play their Ascendancy, and their Ascendancy really helps out with this archetype. So let's look at a little Brokers Super Friends to finish the video. Now this deck has 10 total Planeswalkers in it. You might expect to see more Wandering Emperors, you've seen more of her, than you have New Capenna cards in this video. I can't help that she's just the best card, like in all of Standard. That's not my fault. She belongs in this deck, but so does Wrenn and 7. I apologize, you haven't seen this yet, but this is also a great Planeswalker. But a card from New Capenna that we can play is Vivian on the Hunt. Now we do actually have a few creatures in our Planeswalker deck, so that middle ability isn't entirely dead. You can draw a card every now and again, effectively, but for the most part, what I wanted to do was just make a Rhino every turn, and that's usually the best way to use Vivian, it turns out. It's just make a Rhino, plus, make a Rhino, plus, make a Rhino. That's just the best way to do it, and you do that until one of you is dead. And usually it's going to be your opponent if you make enough Rhinos. In a lot of ways, Aunt Viv is our actual best win condition. She's very reliable once she's actually on the table, but obviously Wrenn and 7 and Wandering Emperor are on screen as well, and they're not too bad at finishing games of Magic either. Wandering Emperor is not sometimes the best at finishing games, but she's really good in the mid-game and very good too at turning the game around to start, getting you back the tempo that you need. Wrenn also fixes our mana in this 3-color deck, so that'll sometimes be important, but for the most part, just like Vivian, make big man, win game, swing, big man. But that's mostly what we're doing. Honestly, this deck is just as caveman in a lot of ways as the Riveteers deck, the Jund deck, but it appears more sophisticated. But no, it's just make big man hit face is what it does. But we're also playing a copy of Teferi and a copy of Tamiyo. Just one apiece here because these aren't the most important Planeswalkers in the world. But Teferi has artifacts and creatures that it can untap, so that's good. Drawing cards is also good with Teferi, so I guess we'll do some of that. And then Tamiyo can bring back a Wandering Emperor or a Wrenn and 7 from the graveyard, which is good. Sometimes you just rip a Tamiyo off the top of your library and kind of trade it for a Planeswalker in your graveyard immediately. That's fine to do, but it can also just tap down a creature. And I've done that. I have done that for 4 turns in a row on multiple occasions. So Tamiyo isn't half bad. We're also playing some just good Magic cards like a Seeka's Chariot. Again, we've seen this card a lot in this video, but I just can't help how good it is, and I really can't help how good it is in this deck. But it and all of our Planeswalkers are especially good with Broker's Ascendancy. Again, I like this with an Asika's Chariot because it can effectively put 3+1/+1 counters on the table the second turn it's in play. You know, this on 3 into a Chariot on 4. Go ahead and crew the Chariot is how you want to do it. Obviously, if your opponent can swing into you, maybe leave the cats up to block. But some of the time, you know, this can go ahead and put, you know, an extra 3 power on the table on the second turn it's in play if you play an Asika's Chariot on curve after it. But this is also pretty decent, you know, into a Wandering Emperor. It's pretty decent into a Teferi or really any Planeswalker. Obviously, Ascendancy plays very well with all of our Planeswalkers and is especially good when we have multiple Planeswalkers on the table. But of course, there's also one copy of Luxior Giada's Gift in here because we have so many Planeswalkers. If we're going to play something gimmicky, like a Planeswalker deck, why not play Luxior? Best place for it, right? We don't necessarily need this. I think our Planeswalkers are good enough win conditions in and of themselves, but in case we do need to attack for the win in a game, this is a good way of doing it. Throw this on a Wandering Emperor or a Wrenn and 7 and actually swing with a Wrenn and 7. Live the dream. Also pretty good, by the way, with the Broker's Ascendancy putting counters on our creatures. Because, you know, maybe a creature goes a few turns getting counters from a Broker's Ascendancy, and then you put a Luxior on it. Suddenly it gets twice as big, or it gets basically double the number of +1/+1 counters, kind of. So, Luxior's neat for a few reasons in this deck. But like I said, there's the odd creature in this deck. We've got 4 copies of Prosperous Innkeeper and 3 copies of Tangled Florahedron. Now, Prosperous Innkeeper fixes our mana, whereas Florahedron doesn't, but it only does it once. Florahedron you can just keep on doing for the rest of the game, which is nice if you want to, say, ramp into on turn 3 in Asika's Chariot. And then on the next turn, you also want to ramp into a Wrenn and 7. And the turn after that, you want to ramp into a Vivian on the Hunt. Well, if you had a Prosperous Innkeeper, you couldn't do all that. But Florahedron can help you do that. So I wanted to play both of these cards. I do think it's important that we get ramp on turn 2 either way. Now, we don't get ramp on turn 2 for some reason. We can get it on turn 3 with a Celestis. We're playing 2 copies of this. This is great because it's, you know, 3 generic mana. It's 3 whatever mana in a 3-colored deck. So we can basically always play it on turn 3 for the most part. And it fixes our mana. It ramps us into these 5 drops and 6 drops and stuff. So it draws cards. It gains life. Just why not play at least a couple of copies of Celestis? We can also untap it with a Teferi, extra tech, bonus points, but there's also 2 copies of Reckoner Bankbuster. This can also get untapped by a Teferi, draw you multiple cards in a turn, get you closer to making the 1/1 that can crew it or whatever. Sometimes you can draw a card with Bankbuster, use Teferi to untap it and get in or block with it or whatever. So just a sweet little combo. I want more stuff Teferi can untap. And in this case, Bankbuster is a great card because we don't have all the ways in the world of drawing cards. Bankbuster does that, while also being very easy to play on turn 2 in our 3-color deck. There's just no end to the positives on Bankbuster. But to finish things off, let's look at some actual removal spells. Even with the creatures we're playing, I'll play 2 copies of Farewell, but we also have 2 copies of Fateful Absence and 4 copies of Endless Detour. Cards like this usually aren't great if you can't close a game of Magic, but this really serves our sort of mid-range philosophy. We will spend a card on this and not get any real card advantage because our opponent will eventually see their card again. But in this case, the tempo is what matters. We may be spending a card and spending basically our entire turn 3 or 4 in order to cast this. But again, after our opponent's turn 3 or 4 play is blown out, we can drop our own 4, 5, 6 mana ridiculous threat, force them to deal with that. So again, we can close the game out relatively quickly after this, and I think that's one of the keys to being able to play a card like this. Now, Esper might actually still be the best Planeswalker deck in the format. It currently is. Or at least before this set came out, it was. I also think Mardu. I think Mardu is very slick. Like, I didn't play Elspeth Resplendent in this deck. Because, you know, we've got like 4 and 5 mana Planeswalkers. I don't want to... Right? You want like a lot of 3 mana stuff in your deck if you're going to play a Resplendent. We don't necessarily have... We have so many things we can whiff on if we try to use Resplendent. However, in Mardu, you have Obnyx Silas. Imagine playing an Elspeth Resplendent, minusing it, hitting an Obnyx Silas. That seems good. So I think Mardu Planeswalkers is fun. You get to play Valky. Good deck. Why am I using the space designated to talk about the band deck to talk about Mardu Planeswalkers? I want to play that deck. But anyway, the Broker Super Friends deck is pretty sweet, mostly because the biggest draw here is you get Broker's Ascendancy. And in a Planeswalkers deck, excuse the pun, it is a bit broken. And later in the game, when you're trying to break through and you've got like I don't know, Chariot, Vivian, Wandering Emperor on the table, you'll be super happy to rip that Broker's Ascendancy off the top. It's not going to do anything before you can really attack, but it's still going to do something that turn, leave you with a bunch of loyalty on your Planeswalkers and much bigger guys. So Ascendancy has just been a very stupid card, and the deck is way better when it actually draws it. But the deck is still fine even if it doesn't draw Broker's Ascendancy because, you know, Wandering Emperor, Seaga's Chariot, Wrenn and 7, it's a good deck. But that is all I got for this one. Again, deck list in the description. If these were a little too rich for your blood, then what I'm thinking about doing next, or very soon, I'll leave it up to the patrons, is a budget version of this basically exact same video. I can't promise you 5 decks or $5 this time, but I still think that there might be a way to build 3-color budget decks in this format. Especially after the Triomes calm down in price a little bit, because I do think you have to play those. But, you know, when I say budget, I mean $50 to $75 versions of these decks that don't play. Are these decks all going to be like $350 a piece? I hope not. I really hope. Don't feel like you have to buy all of these. Don't. It's kind of why I want to do a budget version of this exact same video. Maybe we'll get to that very soon. But I've got a lot of other content I want to get to. I've got a couple of lists I want to do. I've got Esper Angels, a deck that I really want to look at. God, I want to play Giada. Aside from that, make sure you're subscribed for all of the content I'm describing. Subscribe, describe, it works. Also do these things. Twitch, we're going to be playing tonight, actually, if you're watching the video on the day it comes out. We'll be playing on Twitch Thursday night. Check me out over there. It's free to follow. Link in the description. And help me out on Patreon. $1 a month to vote on what content we do next. And I really appreciate the help around here because, you know, pays my bills. It's like how I survive my life. So help me out if you can over there, and I appreciate all the support we've gotten lately. Thanks, guys. But I got to get out of here for now because the red light on my camera is flashing. That means I've taken forever to record this video. I love you all. Let me know how you felt about these decks down there in the comments section. Check them out over there in the description and do all the YouTube stuff. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.